This is a Power 98.7 podcast. Now we're talking. Subscribe to Power 98.7 podcasts in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. There's more on power987.co.za.
Melusi Simelane is my next guest, and that is a political activist. Yes, and we're going to be talking about Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland. Is a ticking time bomb, according, of course, to the human rights activists from that country, and a lot of other activists from that country are beginning to say, as they've been saying over years and years and years, and this is a conversation that, of course, is not going to be the beginning and the end of a conversation of Eswatini. That particular country is in the news all the time, and all the time, every now and again, it blows up a little bit. And then we begin to wonder and suggest to ourselves and to everybody else, and I think people start writing the obituaries of course, the monarchies in those particular countries, like, of course, Eswatini, and then they start writing the obituaries, and then nothing begins to happen. And then SADC has an engagement, and SADC becomes involved, and SADC kinds to, move the conversation in a particular way, and then nothing happens of that particular conversation as well. As we're seeing with the present-day conversations that SADC or South Africa also, Cyril Ramaphosa, is engaged in that country. So a lot of initiatives over all the years. And if you've been following the Eswatini story, then obviously you've been following it for a very, very long time. And every time something happens there, people either get excited or begin to talk about a revolutionary change. Things are beginning to happen. The EFF sometimes, takes to the border and goes and demonstrates on the border with Eswatini, and then nothing comes of that as well. I think that monarch just maybe, looks at everything and goes, what you going to do, what you going to do, what you going to do, and then nothing, of course, happens. Africa's last absolute monarch in that particular country called Eswatini. But let me bring Melusi Simelane into the conversation, Civil Rights Program Manager at Southern Africa Litigation Center. Melusi, welcome to Power 98.7. Welcome to Power Perspective. How are you, man?
I'm very good, and thank you for having me, and good evening to your listeners.
Sure. Melusi, let me just ask you for geography. Where would you be based, Melusi?
I'm currently in Mbabane, the capital of Swaziland.
Oh, right. So you're in Mbabane talking to us from Swaziland.
Yes.
Sure. Melusi, the introduction that I've just given and sort of off the cuff, because, being a journalist who started in the 1990s as a journalist and would have watched some of the developments also in Southern Africa and Eswatini, then known, of course, as Swaziland as well, and, the monarchy and all the protestations that have come and the economic woes that have come and the South African involvement from time to time, SADC's involvement from time to time, and all the kind of things that happen in that particular country. As you now engage, and you are in Mbabane as a civil rights program manager in that country, do you sometimes, as I do, and journalists and people who look at Swaziland or Eswatini and go, change is going to happen now, or do you have a more realistic look at it and think, the monarchy is well entrenched in this country. Nothing's going to shift here for a very long time, maybe for the next 50 years. It's got neighbors who might not show the kind of interest to engage the kind of, things happening in Eswatini as one would like them to happen. So do you have a more thorough, more realistic, more concrete perspective of Eswatini than a lot of other people do who write about Eswatini, who monitor and watch it, and then begin to think change is going to come at the next, demonstration, but it never does?
Yeah, the people who talk about change being inevitable, right? So that's one school of thought. Change is always a constant, something that always happens. But there's a second school of thought that says as change happens, things remain the same. Yeah. So to your question, then one has to grapple with the two, because change is inevitable. It's a fact that the youth of this country, the young people who are constantly calling for democratic reform, who are constantly calling for political reform, are going to win the day. That I am sure of. We have seen it happen in South Africa with apartheid. We have seen it happen in Zimbabwe with, though many might call it a coup, with the former president, Zimbabwe Mugabe. But we've seen it happen almost everywhere in the world. The Arab Spring, the young people always win the day. Change is inevitable. But then, of course, there is the question of the entrenchment of the power of the monarch. You know, when you talk about the Eswatini king, you're talking about someone who controls most of the what we call Swazi nation land. Now, this is all of the land in the country, separate from municipalities, which is then titled. He controls all of that land, and everybody who lives in that land does not own the land. They live there under the powers of the king. So basically, you have to pay allegiance to a chief, who in turn pays allegiance to the king. So in a sense, you have to think twice before you do anything. You have to think twice before you criticize. Even if you're in a position of power, even if you're in a position of privilege, you have to think twice before you can be seen to upset the powers that be, because you remember that you still need land in this country. You still need to be able for you and your families and your loved ones and everyone related to you to live comfortably in the land in this country. So perhaps to answer your question, I would say as a Swati who lives in Swaziland, I'm conscious of the difficulties that we have in terms of separating the monarch as an entity of state from it being an entity of culture and tradition. I'm a Swati who loves my culture, and as a result, I'm of course aware that I have to pay allegiance to the monarch. But when it comes to issues of state, and this now plays along my job, because I work for the Southern Africa Litigation Center and I work in the entire region, and we're well aware of the role that the monarch must play on state matters, and it becomes a problem for us when these two lines are then blurred. And that's why then, in spite of the fact that the powers of the monarch are entrenched in society, I do believe that change is inevitable.
What is it then, after what you've just said, and you use the land issue as a pretty good example of that, what is it then that dictates that the youth will win the day when you've put such a strong argument forward that, you know, people do not want to come forward, people do not want to engage, people, even if they were in a position of privilege, don't want to engage the system because the monarchy is just so strong, and ultimately, you know, control over the land ultimately means you have control over the economy and you have control over everyday, you know, the everyday of people's lives. What makes you then argue, in essence, also on the other side, that the youth will win the day when you've put such a strong argument forward, actually also for the fact that, you know, the monarchy has ultimately entrenched himself in that specific lifestyle of every, you know, person in that country?
You know, on the 21st of January this year, well-known human rights lawyer and political activist Thulani Masego was shot dead in his home. And just to sort of anchor what you're saying about this very strong argument that I'm making, for people to feel the need to sort of hide out and not do the right thing and not call for the change that needs to happen. But I suppose the point that I'm making is it gets to a point where everything erupts. I think if you look at the South African example, for instance, you have Julius Malema, who's always saying you need to be careful of having a leaderless uprising, like something similar to what we saw with the Arab Spring in your early 2011. And I think that's the fundamental point that I'm driving at in saying the young people and the youth are going to win the day, because you can oppress people for so long. And it's a fact that in Eswatini, we live under an authoritarian rule. The fact that we cannot elect a government of our own, the fact that we cannot be allowed to express ourselves without fear of, you know, being harassed or arrested. I mean, just this past week, I was at the Supreme Court where we're monitoring a case that is brought by a local LGBT organization to want to enjoy the right to freedom of association, something so basic. And we're going back to the Supreme Court in June on the 12th, where we are also monitoring and we're supporting a case that is challenging the Suppression of Terrorism Act and the subversive and sedition activities. Because we are saying some of these laws that are being enacted in this country are not aligned to the very constitution. And the fact that we have organizations like ourselves who are supporting this sort of work in the court, in spite of the fact that powerful lawyers like Thulani Masego have been assassinated and others are being harassed and others are in hiding, in spite of the fact that there is that fear, but there is people who are constantly working in trying to bring about the change. And we're not just working on our own. We do have activists on the ground who are constantly showing their faces. We've got student leaders like Thulani Masego who are constantly showing their faces to say change needs to happen. And it calls for us not to lose hope, because yes, we are being harassed. Yes, we are being targeted. I mean, almost everyone that I know lives in fear. But the fact of the matter is, this is our country, and we want to see positive change in our country, and we are not going to give up. So in a sense, when I say the youth are going to win the day, I'm not sort of relegating that sort of responsibility. I'm saying it's going to have to be people like myself. It's going to have to be the everyday citizen in Eswatini who's going to have to stand up and say, how do we frame and create an enabling environment where we live and we coexist with our monarch? Because look, I've already said that there's the cultural and traditional side where even I myself do pay allegiance to the monarch on that side. But when it comes to matters of state, we need to be clear that we live in a constitutional era, and therefore there needs to be that respect and recognition of democratic and political rights.
What gives you hope about the law? In essence, the law hasn't been aligned, like you say, for a long time as well with democratic processes. So the law is not aligned, and that's been something that's been happening in that particular country for forever and a day, for as long as I can remember. And so as you begin to engage as young activists and legal minds, as you begin to challenge some of these aspects, what makes you think that in the courts some things are going to be different than they have been before? Because ultimately they haven't. I'm just trying to understand the mindset here, why somebody would your answer could be one could never give up hope. One constantly has to chip at the block until you get to it. But in more realistic essence, I get the longevity of a struggle and chipping at the block until you make some progress. But we've been down this road so many times, and I'm just worried that your generation, my generation, will see Eswatini in the same scenario, in the same place, when the next generation comes along and they begin to chip at the block as well. So when does change begin to happen? Is there a minute, crack in the wall, crack in that chip of block, that says something's moving, something's shifting, that gives hope,
I think the same could have been asked, when Nelson Mandela was charged and sent to Robben Island, right? I think the same could have been said for many of our ancestors and our forefathers who were killed while they were trying to fight against colonization. So the conversation goes on to the civil rights movement in the Americas and all over the world, right? And you are right. We are on the 50th year of the King's 1973 decree. And it was that 1973 decree, and that it was amended in 87 when the new king came into
And that's
power.
The banning of political parties.
Absolutely. So in a sense, I agree with you that it's been forever and a day. But in terms of how do we then gauge the work that we are working, we are putting on,
and I think that's I think that's my question, Melusi, is how are you engaging your process, and the advancements that you're making? What's the criteria? What's the measurement tool that you're using?
It's very hard. It's very hard to actually measure the progress that we're making, particularly if you are seeing people being constantly locked up, if you're seeing people being constantly harassed and violated.
And there's Thulani Masego, yes.
Thulani Masego being assassinated.
January 21st this year.
Absolutely. And mind you, Thulani Masego lived literally 20 minutes from where I live. And he's a person that I had worked with for so many years. But I suppose the answer to your question is, it's constantly waking up in the morning and saying, I'm going to do as much as I can, no matter how marginal. The fact of the matter is change is inevitable. Whatever contribution that I put towards moving the country forward and making sure that we're all working together. Remember, I made the point that I myself am working with the Southern African Litigation Center, and therefore we are coming on the legal side of things, but we are constantly working with partners on the ground, small community organizations. We're working with sometimes even traditional people who are in particular positions to constantly engage. And for us, being able to sort of have conversations with people in various spaces of society, that for me says we are making a move in terms of creating change for society. And I mean, I'll go to this study that came out from the Afrobarometer. They were saying, actually, I think the last result from the Afrobarometer came out in 2021, where it was actually tracking the interests of people in democracy in Eswatini. And it was actually saying that people in Eswatini now more than ever are actually more interested in having democratic conversations, even though they still fear talking about these things, but they do realize now more than ever that there needs to be some democratic conversation. And it's a small margin of change that was recorded by the Afrobarometer people. But for us, it says that there is this constant change, no matter how marginal, and it will take time. That's why I'm making the example of slavery, of colonization, of apartheid. These things take time, but it calls for us to constantly give ourselves to the movement and say, look, in spite of the fear, we have to do something, because you do not want the generation that comes after us to say we did not do anything.
Having said that, and trying to measure where you are, and I'm also trying to measure, where you are through the conversation. Having said that, does it bring a disturbance or a concern or an irritation even maybe as to where you see the South African stance towards a country like Eswatini and the non-involvement almost, and that whole particular stance whereby, a statement would be made that says, in every country, it will be resolved by the people of that country. And this despite the brutality and the undemocratic spaces that one might find that country in, and, the protests and the violent ways of trying to bring those protests down, and people being killed and people being jailed, and yes, Thulani Maseko, and people keep quiet about it, and yet it's obvious. It's obvious in some sense, in some situations, what's actually going on. Is it an irritation? Is it some form of frustration sometimes that one does see the capacity of a neighboring country and what that capacity could be, and yet the country chooses not to engage in a country where these kind of atrocities are happening? There has to be some form of, it can't only be left to ourselves. Even in the darkest days of apartheid, South Africans looked at the international world and said, you have to help us here. They didn't just look at MK and Appler and all the liberation movements. There was a bigger plan where countries needed to make a stance. South Africa is that big brother in essence to Eswatini and can make such a huge difference, but in a sense doesn't and chooses not to. And you as an activist on the ground, what kind of message does that feed into you and all the other activists where you want there to be movement, but there is no movement?
It's very sad what you're mentioning, because of course we do not live in an island. We do not live in isolation. We are all interrelated, be it the Southern Africa Development Corporation, be it the African Union, be it the Commonwealth, or the entire world under the UN, for crying out loud. There needs to be something that is done by these bodies. I mean, let alone our neighboring countries. I mean, look at SADC and what they did in Lesotho when this whole coups were happening. They were able to actually take the issue serious. And actually, if you look at history of SADC in Eswatini, before the constitution of 2005, SADC was very seriously SADC was very seriously concerned about the development in Eswatini. You need to bring about a constitution so that you can address all of these issues. But the constitution came about in 2005, but nothing actually changed, which is why there's been this constant conversation about whether or not we're living under that King's decree of 50 years ago or we are living under the constitution of 2005. But in terms of, having to react to why South Africa, for instance, as the biggest economic power in SADC, not reacting, or even SADC not reacting to the issues in Eswatini. I think for me, it goes the same way to Zimbabwe. We are constantly following what's happening in Zimbabwe recently. People being constantly arrested. We wrote a statement last year when they actually arrested an author who was on the street with a placard that said, "We want it better." And this is the trend that we're seeing in the region. And we do remember, of course, also with the EFF's national shutdown in South Africa, where President Cyril Ramaphosa sort of said all those serious words, including the police minister. And for us, it says there's this trend in the region where they are trying to oppress and silence dissent. There's this trend where you are not allowed to have a political opinion. And for us, then it becomes a question of whether or not our neighbors can hold to account those who are dictators and despots in their countries, particularly if they themselves have some checking to do within their own houses. They have some housekeeping to do within their own countries. But I suppose, again, what we would call on as a Southern African Education Center and myself would be to strengthen the SADC body and make sure that we bring about that tribunal that was removed in 2008, 2009, because that was a very strong body that allowed for us, political activists and the human rights defenders, to once failing in our own countries, go to the SADC body to remind them of the SADC Charter and the African Charter, and ensuring that they are upholding human rights and they're making sure that they are protecting not only human rights but also human rights defenders, so that we do not see this continued harassment, targeting, arresting, and sometimes assassination of human rights defenders in our region.
Was 2005 and that 2008, 2009 moment a missed opportunity to actually, bring change to Eswatini? And I say that because I also, as we talk about 2005 and then, the tribunal of 2008 and 2009 through the SADC process, was it a missed opportunity? And as I say that, and look at the, SADC today that we talk about and say SADC should be more involved, do you think also, when I look at the leadership of SADC at that particular time, and I look at the leadership of, the SADC region today, and I say maybe also it was a leadership issue where, at that particular time, those were the stalwarts of those particular countries who, when they did stand up and say something, they were taken very seriously, within the SADC region or, within the African continent or, even the United Nations. It was a different type of leadership at that particular point. And maybe with the demise of leadership over time and the loss of a voice within the African continent, and so to the regional bodies like SADC and that loss of a voice on these international platforms as well, comes a lot of change as well that doesn't happen. So maybe a moment that wasn't taken because the leadership of that particular point very different from the leadership that we seemingly have within the SADC region at the moment.
The sad thing about corruption, particularly at the leadership level, is that it denies an opportunity for those who have the leadership skills that is needed at that very high level, right? By putting people who do not know what they're doing.
But apart from that, Melusi, I think you're making a very good point. Apart from that, corruption also takes away your voice. Because once you've engaged in corruption, you do not have the authority, the moral authority, to begin to talk to anybody in a sober manner, and they also don't take you as seriously as they should, because they will then remind you of the sins that you have committed.
Absolutely. That is why then I would say, similarly, going back to your opening earlier when you started this program, you talked about, is it the head or is it the neck that's in leadership? And I wanted to say just in that, I refuse to say that Africa has a leadership crisis.
Yeah.
I think it's us, the people, who have a leadership crisis by refusing to take the mantle on our hands, by refusing to actually put and take them to task. Remember I said, I believe that the youth are going to win the day, but I suppose we are taking too slow. I suppose we're taking too slow to hold our leaders accountable, because what we need is active citizenship. And I think we are doing ourselves disservice by allowing these people who clearly do not have what it takes to take Africa forward, to take Southern Africa forward, and indeed to take our country in our respective regions forward. And I think it's us, the citizens, therefore the neck and not the head, that needs to take the blame, because it cannot be that Africa is where it is today and we can just resign ourselves to say that we've got a leadership crisis and therefore there is a sort of bankruptcy of leadership skills in Africa. And the answer is no. There's a lot of people who have what it takes, but unfortunately we've allowed for these systems to rot from the top. And of course, when you talk about SADC, I mean, many people have called it a gentleman's club, but I personally cannot call it that, because we're constantly engaging with the SADC bodies to ensure that they're holding their member states accountable, particularly to the African Charter, and ensuring that there's respect for civil and political rights. And that's how I'm then motivated or in fact, encouraged to believe that the young are going to win the day, and change is inevitable, and change is going to come.
Let's talk about SADC then, and an initiative that our president is involved in, that agreement for a national dialogue. 2020, 2021, it's... every now and again when SADC meets, there's some suggestion that Eswatini is on the agenda, and that agreement for a national dialogue comes up and is used as the mechanism again to have a conversation about Eswatini, but it never really goes anywhere. Where's the hope? Where's the value of that agreement for a national dialogue that came about, I think, because of those particular unrest that we saw, I think, in 2020, and this particular, decision to have and the agreement to have a national dialogue came about. But, it's great to have it at the time. It's great. It's a great initiative to bring the violence to an end. And then once the violence seems to have come to an end, the initiatives don't move at the same pace. They drag on, and sadly they drag on from institutions that should be driving them. I mean, I can understand why the authorities in Eswatini would want them to drag on, but there's no reason why SADC should hold and drag the processes even further and delay them to the extent that one wonders where that particular agreement is.
Right. Now, remember you said earlier there is the question of moral authority. If SADC as a body, if the leaders within SADC as a body have themselves deficiencies, I mean, I'll call them deficiencies, but there's some corruption scandals following them. Even if it's not corruption scandals, there's issues of authoritarianism that in their respective countries. If they've got that issue to deal with, then they lack the moral authority to hold our comrade leader, the monarch in our country, to account and actually to bring about this national dialogue. But I mean, I'll just add that it's actually on top of the whole dialogue conversation. It's been over 2 years now. Two members of parliament are still in jail to this day because they call for democratic reforms, something that they were actually speaking on behalf of their electorate. So I think the whole thing of SADC committing to a national dialogue in Eswatini is a facade, because remember when the Namibian president was in Pretoria recently visiting President Ramaphosa, they both wished Eswatini well on the coming national election, which is actually slated for August or sometime about that. And the question is, when are we supposed to have a national dialogue before we can go to another parliamentary election? Because remember, people are now scared to go into parliament, because if you go into parliament and you start speaking the truth, then you are going to be serving time in jail, because remember, we've got 2 members of parliament who are in jail for calling for political reforms. So in a sense, what they are saying is that let's go to an election so we can elect people who are going to go into the parliament chamber and start singing Kumbaya. And that's the problem that we have in Eswatini, and particularly in the region, because remember, we have an election coming in Zimbabwe as well, and what we are seeing is very sad. So I think I would call it a facade, what they were saying in terms of committing to a national dialogue in Eswatini, because I believe it is that national dialogue that will sort of bring the country together in terms of formulating and creating an enabling environment for everyone to raise their concern and voice out their criticism or dissent to whatever, so that we can build a nation that works for all, and a nation that is going to contribute not just for itself, but also contribute to the entire SADC region. There's a lot of issues that affect us as SADC. There's a whole issue of migration. There's a whole issue of trafficking. There's a myriad of issues that we can deal with as a Southern African regional body. I mean, there's unemployment. There's a whole lot of things that need for us to work together. But if we are busy in each country fighting within ourselves and fighting among ourselves, then we are not getting the opportunity to fight against these issues. There's climate change, for instance, that requires the whole region to work together. So I think really SADC needs to take their mandate more seriously. But again, I wouldn't put the task on the leadership of SADC. I'd put it on us as young people. I'd put it on us as citizens. And I'd put it on us as the taxpayers in our respective countries to actually hold our leaders to account in ensuring that we participate in what is called active citizenship, so that we can, take our countries forward and therefore take Africa forward.
How does the shooting of Thulani Maseko just take the whole initiative backwards, and take the whole struggle, for democratization backwards in a sense? Take all the conversations backwards, or do you think that it's almost like a slingshot? It enhances it creates further conversation. It brings other role players to the attention of what's going on in Eswatini. How does the death of a Thulani Maseko then play itself out in Eswatini? Does it take the conversation backwards? Does it silence the conversations for a while? Or do you think that it adds value to the conversation and adds more impetus, to the conversations and to the efforts by merely the fact that, a human rights activist has been killed and something needs to be done and we need to talk about it? But we've spoken about so many of them, having been killed and tortured and jailed in that particular country, that, one doesn't know when there is a value to a conversation of that particular nature or not, or whether he takes it backwards. What's your take on the Thulani Maseko, killing? Has it taken the conversation further and brought it to a place where one needs to talk about it because it has happened? Or does it make people cower in the corner and think, oh, I could be next? I mean, you were telling me you were not very far from, where he lived, and you're in the same space. And so, people do disappear at night and then, get tortured and end up in prison or just vanish.
Yeah. Well, it's really difficult to answer the question, because on the one hand, I have personally experienced, a lot of people are now less visible in terms of talking about issues. But on the other hand, I have seen how more international and regional parties have been galvanized to come into the country to say, how can we support? What's the messaging? Whom should we talk to in terms of elevating and escalating this conversation? And we were seeing reports just recently that in the United States Senate, there was a conversation about a response, whether it's targeted sanctions or whatnot. But in a sense, I would say that the demise of Thulani, for me personally, has been very heartbreaking. It has actually rendered me paralyzed in some instances. But then again, I've been reminded and I've been reignited to say, look, his life cannot be in vain. And as a result, I need to redouble my efforts and ensure that I do more than I have before. Because look, at the end of the day, if they want you, they are going to get you, whoever they are, because I cannot say for sure who did, who took Thulani's life. But the fact of the matter is, the killing of Thulani has sort of re-energized myself and many others to say, look,
but paralyzed a lot of others and made them less visible as well.
Equally, exactly. So that's why I was saying earlier, it's a little difficult for me to respond to that question. But I would say that the work is cut out for us, and we are going to do everything that we can. And we still call on on SADC or maybe the African Union to actually come and investigate, because I personally, and I believe on behalf of the Southern Africa Litigation Center, we cannot trust an investigation that would be handled by the state authorities, particularly because we've seen what the state has been doing to many other political activists and human rights defenders in the country. Sure. And as a result, we would only trust an independent investigation from outside to actually look at the killing of Thulani, and not just Thulani alone, because there's a lot of other human rights defenders who have been in hiding, who continue to be in hiding because they've been harassed, they've been targeted. Others are still in jail. Others are being charged on trumped-up terrorism charges, which is why, again, I mentioned we are going to the Supreme Court on June 12th, where we are challenging some clauses of the Suppression of Terrorism Act laws and sedition laws, because we are worried about how these laws are created so that they can target those who have a dissenting voice. So we will continue to do the work in spite of the fact that our lives continue to be in danger. But I do believe that it's our lives that must be paid for the betterment of everyone else and the creation of a better country for all.
Sure. Melusi, let me bring Lennox into the conversation. Lennox?
Evening, Denzil, and to your guest.
Sure, bro.
Yeah, I have a question for Melusi.
Sure,
first of all, I just want to say that, change is bound to happen there. I mean, the whole world is actually evidence to all of us that life evolves from aristocracy to democracy all over the world. And so it's bound to happen there as well. But the saddest part is that not SADC will be helpful in this regard. That much I'm sure. You look at the most recent developments, in the region. They've been defeated so many times with the Zimbabwean situation, and so you can at least expect they will do anything meaningful for Swaziland. But the change that's going to come, I think they're holding up a very good fight there. And surely, even if the army could be filled with royal and regal generals, not the entire army will be full of such people, and so it might also come from there. But I just hope that if a coup ever happens to happen there, that it be something that ends up, bloodlessly. But surely the amount of pressure that the people are putting up against this monarchy is sufficient enough to get things there, even though it may happen a little bit later.
Sure.
But
Lennox, I have a question to you first, and maybe Melusi can also just talk about that then. And in the context of a coup, I mean, one then doesn't have the luxury then of engaging your standing as maybe a monarchy as you would in a negotiated, environment. In the context of a coup, you almost are now being dictated to as to the role you will play. Whereas in a negotiated settlement of some sort in a democratic, formulated space, you could pretty much dictate where, and how much space and how much voice you have.
Yeah, unfortunately, Denzil, I agree with you. But the unfortunate part of that situation there is, and surely Melusi will actually agree partially or fully on some of what I'm going to say. So for so many times, engagements have happened there. And the only time when a real engagement happens would be if there is a foreign intervention. But internally, when that has to happen, people end up in jail. Some end up, being assassinated. And so the only time when people are going to realize that, change is got to happen in a particular way, they're going to see through that as one of the means to actually get them there, unfortunately.
Sure. Yeah. Ask your question, Lennox.
My question is to Melusi. The Supreme Court, how fit for purpose is it? Because, I've seen for so many times that it came up with extremely absurd rulings, from where I sit. And who does the appointment of presiding officials of that institution? That's my question. Two questions.
Lennox in Sasolburg. Melusi, you can comment on the previous, and maybe you don't want to comment on the coup part, because that ultimately is not the conversation of the evening, and that's the route we don't really want it to go. But it's just a point I was making in that particular context. But I think Lennox has a good question about the judiciary.
Yeah. Perhaps just to say on the whole thing about a national dialogue. I mean, it was a suggestion of the SADC body, and it's something that a local grouping called Multi-Stakeholder Forum, which is actually a grouping of political parties, civil society organizations, and interested parties, actually all agreed on. So, I mean, I would agree with you in saying perhaps for Eswatini, the route would be a national dialogue, a national building dialogue, or a political building dialogue, where we can then formulate a way forward. But also on the question of the judiciary, I mean, I would not want...
just also, Melusi, just on that particular question, because that allows, as you say, you yourself as a citizen, you look at things in two ways. One, you look at it as the monarchy needs to exist, and you are respectful respectful to the monarchy. And so there is that particular place for the monarchy to continue and exist. In the other one, we talk about the democratic space. And so, and absolutely. And in that particular dialogue, those two elements become what's on the table, and you discuss their space.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. That's why I do believe that a dialogue would be the way to go. But yeah, the question on the appointments of judges. Look, I would not want to insult our judiciary, because my line of work, we constantly in court, we're constantly challenging judgments by the High Court, the Supreme Court, and we're constantly working with the Minister of Justice in bringing trainings into the country, as we do in every other country in the region. But in terms of who appoints the judges, I mean, there's the JSC in Eswatini, but all of the members of the JSC are appointed by the monarch, and then both members then advise the monarch in terms of who should be in the benches, be it the High Court or the Supreme Court. That's all I would say about that, but I wouldn't want to say anything bad about our judiciary. But the writings on
you have to work through them. You have to work through them, and they are part of the process in which you engage.
Absolutely.
Melusi Simelane, thank you so much. It's 12 o'clock midnight, and I'm assuming it's 12 o'clock midnight in Eswatini as well. And so both of us need to get to bed at some point. So I'm going to say thank you so much for being a guest here on Power Perspective tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for sharing the views that you have shared.
Thank you, and good night.
That's Melusi Simelane, Civil Rights Program Manager at Southern African Litigation Center, joining me at...
You've been listening to a Power 98.7 podcast. For more podcasts, visit power987.co.za or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.